And it's past. So, hi everyone, welcome to our energy webinar. This is the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland Energy webinar. Thanks for joining us for this Climate Week event. This year we're doing things a little differently as we're celebrating digitally. It's so important that we continue to recognise Climate Week as it provides the opportunity for us to showcase the work being done to tackle the climate crisis. Today we're going to hear from three fantastic speakers who are presenting on their work and research. Starting with Hannah Ladd-Jones from Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland. She'll be providing an overview of MASTS and the work and research that they undertake. Next we'll have Simon Waldman from Hull University, and he will be speaking on the topic of policy and tidal energy extraction. And to finish, we will hear from Kelly James from Blue Carbon Forum and University of Glasgow, and she'll be speaking on Coraline algae beds and carbon capture and storage. If you'd like to ask our speakers any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature if you're joining us on Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can use the live chat box. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access the slides and information or rewatch and share. So now that we've got the introductions out the way, we can go ahead and start with our first speaker, with Hannah Ladd-Jones. Hi, Hannah.
Hi. Okay, great. Thank you, Leah, and thank you, Benny, for allowing me to talk today. I'm Hannah Ladd-Jones. I am the Public Engagement Officer for MASTS, and so what I'm going to be talking about today is just a very brief overview, because there's so much more I could talk about with MASTS, is who we are, our members, our structure, and how MASTS does and can collaborate with policymakers from Scottish Government and elsewhere as well. So before I actually get into the talk, I would really love to know who is joining us in this session. So I'm just going to launch a poll. For those who are joining us on Zoom, please select an answer that best represents you. It is which of these best describes your area of work. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm sorry you can't participate in the poll, but please feel free to type in your response on the chat, and we'll be able to see basically who's here, because unfortunately I can't see any of you and I have no idea where you're joining us from. So just to know where best describes your area of work. So just a couple of seconds to get those answers in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So 76% of you who voted are joining us from an environmental, rural, forestry, marine energy background, and a couple of other people joining in from teams such as local government, external affairs, and other. So thank you so much for joining today, and I hope you find today's talk informative. So, what is MASTS? MASTS brings together Scotland's marine science capacity within one single organisation. With contributions from Scottish Funding Council and partner organisations, MASTS was launched in 2009 and saw its second phase commencing in 2017. It ensures that Scottish marine science remains internationally competitive and provides an academic platform and knowledge of marine governance, industry and innovation. Many of our partners are universities, but many are not, and I've listed some of those on the screen here. We have Marine Scotland Science as a partner organisation, JNCC, St Abbs Marine Station, just to name a couple. And this pooling of marine research talent has a constituency of more than 750 researchers across Scotland. But how do we all fit into it? MASTS is organised to maximise communication between all our members and to ensure that there is total policy and procedure transparency. So we have our governing council, advisory committee and executive committee, who then feed to the MASTS Directorate. And within the MASTS Directorate are those names that you're probably going to recognise: Professor David Patterson as our executive director, Dr. Mark James as the operations director, and Dr. Emma Defew, who is the programme manager of MASTS. We also have MASTS Scotland, which with its charitable status allows MASTS Scotland to lead on projects on behalf of our member organisations, form binding agreements both nationally and internationally, and with that we possess a PIC number, which then allows us to lead on EU projects as well. So we can take projects further than just Scotland as well. A major objective of MASTS is to enhance Scottish marine research environment through improved coordination and collaboration. So to achieve this, MASTS has established 3 major research themes, which are listed here, and that is to organise the research of the MASTS community, and these themes also strongly reflect marine policy of Scottish Government. So please note that the Productive Seas is currently undergoing recruitment for an elected leader for that research theme. With those research themes, we then have 12 forums, which are broken down into these categories here of different marine science disciplines. These forums are made up of members of MASTS from their backgrounds due to their interests, and we have PhD students involved in some, early career researchers, PIs, and then obviously members from our non-university partner organisations as well. And general forum objectives can be facilitating networking and information exchange within the forum by meetings and workshops, but also they're able to develop nationally, regionally, and sectorally relevant strategic research agenda, providing a direction and a measure of priority to research in a particular area. So they're able to develop a coordinated approach in interactions with funding bodies, government, and other stakeholders. And they're also there to be a provider of impartial advice to key stakeholders. So if you're listening and you want to get involved in one of these forums or would like to chat with them, please let us know. We are more than happy to put you in contact with the elected convener for this forum, who can then take that chat a little bit further with you as well. I should highlight that the Marine Climate Change Forum is our newest forum, and I'm going to be talking about what they're up to in a few slides. Working relationships between institutions within MASTS has been hugely successful. And by doing so, we are able to develop collaborations across disciplines within the realm of marine science. We're able to highlight available scientific knowledge through communications between our members, but then also pinpoint knowledge gaps, which then can be put to good use by putting a proposal together, for instance, within forums or between forums or within a research theme as well. We're able to support government policy and development too, and then train the next generation of decision makers, which my next slide is going to be about. MASTS has 2 graduate schools. The MASTS Graduate School originally started in 2009 with MASTS, but then in 2019 we launched the Super DTP program, the Scottish Universities Partnership for Environmental Research Doctoral Training Program. And MASTS doesn't just offer the opportunity to do a PhD in an institution, it offers amazing one-of-a-kind kind of training experiences that come with it too. So we have our annual retreat every year, we have specialist training and workshops, and MASTS is a huge advocate for industry collaborative PhDs, fellowships, internships, not just within Scotland either, but internationally too. And many of our alumni have not just stayed in the realm of academia, they have gone on to other organisations and teams as well, such as Marine Scotland Science, the Natural History Museum in London, the MMO, for instance, and many others too. Networking across Scotland. With our ties across Scotland due to our partners and organisations, we're able to successfully network further with industry through the successes of the Scottish Innovation Centres that are shown here too. So we have those ties as well. MASTS actively collaborates with partners nationally through representation on a number of strategic groups listed here. So the Marine Science Coordination Committee, the Marine Strategy Forum, the SMMR Program, which I will talk about in a couple of slides as well, and the Super DTP Program, so that graduate school too. Internationally, we are recognised as because MASTS has been accepted as one of the 3 UK organisations that's represented in the European Marine Board, and also we are involved in the European Marine Biological Resource Centre too. Just to highlight a couple of international collaborative projects that are ongoing that have MASTS members involved, we have the One Ocean Hub led by the University of Strathclyde and the EU Atlas and subsequent I-Atlantic Project 2 led by the University of Edinburgh. An example of MASTS working with policy can be seen in the case study that is being put forward by the Dynamics and Properties of Marine Systems research theme. So that was one of those 3 research themes that I showed earlier. This research theme is working on a case study on the Atlantic approaches to the Scottish continental shelf and slope, and it's being coordinated by the University of Edinburgh, Marine Scotland Science and JNCC. This case study will include the area of the Faroe Shetland Channel and the proposed West of Scotland Marine Protected Area 2. This collaboration was formed because the DPMS research team put out a call to the MASTS community saying, where would you like to do a collaborative project? It can be on a specific area, habitat, species, and we'll be able to do some workshops on this and highlight where we have expertise on it and also where there are research gaps too. So these teams came forward and we've actually joined 2 case studies into one by looking at this general area as well. So those 3 teams are going to be working together. And they're going to be having a series of workshops as well, which are still open to other people to get involved in. So drop us a line if you want to find out more about this work. Another example that has come from a forum has come from the Governance and Planning MASTS Forum 2. The forum are involved in the final report by the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, examining the experience of developing and implementing regional marine plans in Scotland. So they responded to a call that was put out by the committee and were successful due to their international expertise. And they are doing a review, an international review, I should say, of other marine planning regimes, just to, as it says here, using marine planning to balance competing demands on the marine environment. So they're just a couple of examples that are currently undergoing. The SMMR Program stands for Sustainable Management of UK Marine Resources. This is a £12.4 million programme which is being managed by the MASTS Directorate. And the programme aims to bring together marine scientists, policymakers, industry representatives, wider stakeholders and the public to build on a strong marine research community and ultimately bridge the gap between science and policy. So exactly what MASTS is all about, really. A quick shout out about the MASTS Climate Change Forum and what they're up to. They are doing lots of things at the minute, and one of them is the carbon literacy course for marine scientists. So this is a carbon literacy course that is aimed at bringing climate action to everyday lives, and the forum is developing a course for marine scientists specifically in association with Keep Scotland Beautiful. So they're working on that right now. Keep an eye out on your emails if you're already signed up to the MASTS mailing list for more information when that becomes live. They're also looking at a review of research priorities for marine science relating to climate change to support Scottish governments and international efforts to address the climate emergency. And of course, they are lining up a series of events and activities that align with the upcoming COP26 that's happening next year too. And a lot more information is going to be coming from this team. So keep an eye on your emails if you signed up to the MASTS mailing list. If you're not, just go to the MASTS website, you'll be able to do it there. And also an eye on the MASTS Twitter page too. MASTS is very much aware of the plans and commitments within Scottish Government. And I thought I'd just highlight a couple of documents here where MASTS can really get involved in, or it already is involved in, I should say. So one of these is the Protecting Scotland and Renewing Scotland Government Programme, which came out, I think, just last week. And within this document, there is a proposal for a Blue Economy Action Plan. And here we see real potential to collaborate with Scotland's science-based marine industries and the marine environmental sector expertise too. And in that plan, it actually mentions the Inshore Modernisation Programme, which has strong ties to MASTS already due to the SIFIDS project, Scottish Inshore Fisheries Integrated Data System project, which was a MASTS associated project that started in 2017. And that further links to the Future Fisheries Management Strategy too. The Environment Strategy for Scotland, Visions and Outcomes. The text that I've put up onto the screen here is one of the 6 outcomes that is highlighted in this document. And MASTS can really assist in many things that relate to this document, such as identifying strategic priorities and opportunities within marine science and working with strategies and plans that already exist across government as well. So we can also support collective and collaborative efforts in areas that will have the greatest impact on multiple and achievable outcomes too. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight the Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. So in Chapter 6, which is listed here, it highlights that there were targets to have 10% of coastal waters to be protected, and this has been met, which is great. And also that there are upcoming plans too, which MASTS is already involved in some shape or form, such as the second iteration of the Scotland's Marine Atlas and the Dynamic Coasts 2 project, which is launching later this year, I believe. My final slide for you all is that MASTS is having its annual science meeting later this year, next month actually, from the 5th to the 9th of October. It's titled as Decade of Innovation because we are now 10 years old. So we have global speakers, we have special themed sessions, exclusive networking sessions as well for early career researchers, PhDs, and we really hope that you can join us. We have discounted student tickets as well if you're joining and you haven't already signed up. And all the information that you need can be found on that website that is linked below. So this was a really quick whirlwind tour of what MASTS is all about. And there's so much more I could tell you about it. But if you have any questions, just drop us an email and we are more than happy to talk through anything. So thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Hannah. That was a great talk and a really nice overview of what MASTS does generally, which is a lot. So we have one question here on the Q&A so far from Claire. And she says, hello, this is a dull practical question. We love dull practical questions, but I'd love to know where exactly to sign up for your newsletter. I can't find it on your website. Thank you.
Okay, that's a really great question to ask because I can totally answer it. So all you need to do is go on the website here, the www.masts.ac.uk, scroll down slightly and you will see that there is an image of like a glass bottle with a piece of paper in it and it says mailing lists. Click on that link where it says mailing lists, and then you'll be able to actually select information you would like to receive. So whether it's relating to a specific forum or just generally, there's a lot of options that you can choose from. So if you want to find out more from MASTS on just regarding fisheries, that's an option for you to select. And then we will send you any information that is relevant for you. So yeah, just check out the MASTS website. And of course, please join us for the MASTS annual science meeting as well.
Great. Claire has got it. She has already done that. Brilliant. Yeah, that's fantastic. And I guess if you're looking to connect with MASTS for a specific query, as you say, that's a way of doing it as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. I don't see any questions on the YouTube link. So thanks, Hannah. That was great. And over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Hannah. Yep, next up we have Simon Waldman, who's going to be talking about tidal energy extraction. Hi, Simon.
Hi there, welcome. Let me get my screen share going. Feels odd to be the meat and the research sandwich. I'm not quite sure what that analogy means here. Best not to speculate. I'm going to turn off my camera for now because I know from experience that my terrible internet connection can't cope with that and a screen share. I'll see you again for the Q&A at the end. So as you can see, I'm with the University of Hull in the Energy and Environment Institute, and that institute is a multidisciplinary group trying to look at some of the big problems around energy and environment from different angles. And most of our expertise is in offshore energy, well, renewable energy in general, and in flooding and flood risk. We are disadvantaged, as you've noted, by not being in Scotland. But most of the work I'm going to talk about today was actually done while I was at Heriot-Watt a couple of years ago and while I was working with Marine Scotland Science. So I'm going to start right off with a poll, please, Hannah, asking just how familiar are you with tidal energy? This is just to help me get a pitch of who I'm talking to. We've got answers here ranging from I have a detailed understanding of tidal energy and policy, it's probably my job, down to at the bottom, what are tides? Any of those is fine, but it's helpful to have an idea what level we're working at. Okay, thank you, Hannah, that's really helpful. So we have one person whose job it apparently is. We've got 74% who understand the principles of tides and how they're used for energy, a few who are not so clear on the energy angle, and a very few who aren't so familiar with tides in general. So that's quite helpful. Let me close that. What today's talk has come out of is some research that we did a couple of years ago. There is a lot of physics that's understood around tidal energy, and in particular how multiple tidal energy developments will interact with the environment and with each other, which has clear implications for policy. But we realized that this had all been published in technical journals and no one had really told the policymakers. So that's why I'm now going around talking about it at every opportunity. And those people who are more into energy might already have seen a longer version of this talk, in which case I'm sorry for wasting 15 minutes of your time. But in this slightly shortened version, there's two main points I want to get over. One is that, of course, every energy extraction has environmental impacts. That's inevitable. But in the case of tide, there is no simple trade-off between the amount of electricity we get and the amount of environmental impact. It's possible to get quite a lot of electricity with a modest impact if we get it right, and it's possible to get a small amount of electricity with a major impact if we get it wrong. And I'm going to try and show you that we need some strategic planning to make sure we get it right. And the second thing is that tidal farms are going to affect each other at large scales. And when you consider they might be owned by different companies, that has all sorts of questions about coordination and liability. For those a bit less familiar, we're not talking here about tidal stream barrages. We're not putting a dam across an estuary or doing anything of that kind of scale. We're talking about tidal stream turbines similar to the one on the right, similar to, well, don't tell us to a mechanical engineer, but things that look like an underwater wind turbine. And this stuff doesn't matter right now. The systems that are in the water at present, the ones that Maygen have in the Penland and Firth, the ones that Nova Innovation have in Shetland, and a few others around the Scottish coast, where they've got a few turbines, it's not going to have an effect beyond the immediate vicinity of those turbines. So this stuff doesn't matter yet. But it will start to matter when we scale up to having hundreds or thousands of these devices. And at some point, we're going to have to scale up to that level if we want tidal energy to be an important contributor to national electricity production. And the last kind of precursor point here is when I'm talking throughout this talk about environmental impact, mostly I'm talking about changes to the flow of the water. A little bit also about changes to the highest water level we reach, mostly about changes to the flow. And not many people care about that directly, but as any ecologist present will probably be well aware, once you start changing the flow, you start changing the stress that's on organisms on the seabed, you start potentially changing the connectivity, the biological connectivity between different sites and so forth. So you start to accumulate biological and ecological effects as a result of those changes. Now, the first thing is to look at why we might need strategic planning. And here's a bit of a cartoon tidal channel, a very simple one. The tide flows from left to right and then right to left, but we'll assume it's one way for the moment to keep things simple. There are two islands in this channel. And let's imagine that our first tidal energy developer comes along and says, okay, for whatever reason, I'm going to build my tidal farm to the north of the first island. And so this is what happens. As we're all familiar with intuitively, if you put a partial barrier or blockage in the way of flow of water, the water will tend to try to go around it. So that's what's going to happen here. The amount of water flowing through that tidal farm will be a bit less than the water that was flowing through that channel originally. And some of that water instead will divert to go around the tidal farm to the south of that island. And it will accelerate as it just does so because it's going through a smaller gap. So at that point, the tidal energy farm is getting a little bit less power than we might have anticipated. And we cause a bit of an environmental impact in the south by increasing the rate of flow there. And that's probably all fine. This developer probably anticipated this and he's probably planned things so he can still make a profit with that reduced flow. Now let's suppose another developer comes along and let's say this guy's a bit stupid and he looks at things as they are now and says, well, there seems to be more power on the south side of this channel. And for whatever reason, maybe a grid connection, maybe something else, I want to install on the second island. So I'm going to put my tidal farm here. And now we've ended up with pretty much the worst case scenario where both of these tidal farms are only getting a small amount of power because there's only a small amount of water flowing through them. But a lot of water has been accelerated round one island, swerving round to the other island, and we're causing a major environmental impact all over this channel. By contrast, if we'd taken a view from the beginning that we'd like to install tidal energy in this channel, how can we do it best? We might have advised these two developers to go opposite sides of the same channel. At this point, assuming there's no other way for the water to go, the extra resistance, well, the water still has to get through here, so it's going to go through regardless. And so the flow through those tidal farms is almost as much as the undisturbed flow. And because they are evenly across the channel, there's no diversionary route around them. We don't have any of this acceleration, so we have much smaller impacts. And okay, this is a very simplified view. In reality, no one is going to be so stupid as to do what's at the top, because no one's going to invest tens of millions in a tidal farm without doing a bit of modeling of what's going to happen. But when you imagine a far more complicated system, like some of the Scottish archipelagos, with many channels that all interact with each other and many developers, it gets a lot less obvious, and it becomes fairly clear that allowing people to just install one at a time and looking at consenting one at a time like that is not necessarily going to give us the optimum outcome. And when I say the optimum outcome, I mean either getting as much energy as we can for a given level of acceptable impact, or getting the minimum level of impact for a certain level of energy. So this is why we argue that strategic planning is needed. And there's a bit of a demonstration here based on some work that was done at Marine Scotland Science a few years ago. And in fact, these scenarios are not based on different horizontal layouts, they're based on different vertical layouts of turbines, but the principle remains. The scenarios A and B here both extract the same amount of electricity. They both have a mean power of 1.4 gigawatts. But because they have different turbine arrangements, as I say, in this case vertically, they have markedly different environmental effects. So this is really demonstrating that the level of electricity output and the level of environmental impact do not have to go together. If we get it right, we can have a lot of one without too much of the other. I will stop for a moment and emphasize this is a extreme scenario that was modeled for the purposes of looking at these differences. No one is actually planning to install quite this much in this location. It wouldn't work out economically or environmentally. And in particular, scenario B is probably going to flood Stromness, and no one's actually going to propose doing that. So please don't worry about it in that regard. It's purely a demonstration of the concept. So moving on, we've seen that first cartoon almost, that the two tidal arrays can interact with each other and can of course effects on each other. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. Let's imagine we have a channel here with tidal turbine A installed and merrily generating away, not tidal turbine, tidal farm, it's more than one turbine. He's merrily generating away, making a decent amount of profit and a decent amount of electricity. Now B comes along and installs right next to him in the same channel, just behind him. So both of them are now getting about half of the power that A was getting before, in terms of what they could potentially extract anyway. So does B have a liability towards A? Does A have any redress towards B for this change? Similarly, in something similar to that first diagram we looked at a couple of slides ago, A and B here are next to each other across the channel. When we looked at it before, there was an island. Here, there's no island. In most circumstances, that's going to be quite similar physics. So A and B are both helping each other because A, by its presence, is preventing the water from diverting around B and vice versa. And that's all great, and they are mutually beneficial. And again, they're both making a tidy profit and making plenty of clean energy. And then B stops working. Maybe B has some major reliability problems, or maybe B was planned but never actually built. Suddenly A is getting a lot less water through their turbines, and maybe A is no longer financially viable. Do they have redress against B for not operating or for not building? Similarly, A's environmental impact has just increased because B isn't there. So when we're doing environmental impact assessments for an individual large tidal farm, how meaningful are they looking at each farm in isolation rather than looking at the complete picture? And there's a third question here. I know the concept of tragedy of the commons, well, not the concept. I know the originator of it is a subject of controversy at present. Turns out he was a racist and so forth. The concept is still a valid one. There's a potential for it to arise here. The This is some modeling that was done by a group at Imperial a number of years ago. And they put 4 tidal farms into one region in this simulation. And they optimized the tidal farms in 2 different ways. The numbers outside the brackets are where they optimize the tidal farm for the maximum power for each tidal farm independently. And the numbers in the brackets are where they optimize for the maximum total power across the whole region. And the thing to note here is that the numbers outside the brackets are always bigger than the numbers inside the brackets. That may not be universally true in every location, but it certainly is in this particular site. So that suggests that if these 4 tidal farms were owned by different companies, any one company could start extracting more energy than they were meant to, and they'd do better from it as long as no one else did the same. But of course, if everybody did it, then everyone would be worse off than when they started. And if anyone does it, then the total amount that's generated from the region will be less. So it's an individual benefiting at the cost of the whole. So moving on from that, there are 4 things we'd like to get out of any management approach to this to try and avoid some of these problems. One is holistic planning. We think that it's necessary to be able to plan in advance where the tidal farms are going to go and how much energy each one should be extracting. A second one is forward visibility, which is very similar to the first, but is more to do with the designers of the first tidal farm being able to know what else is coming, because it will affect their optimum blade shapes and things like that. We need to discourage overproduction to prevent that tragedy of the commons situation. And we need some form of compensation where one farm's failure to produce what they were expecting to is actually detrimental to another farm. I'm going to be very brief here, partly for time reasons and partly because I'm not the policy person who was involved in this project, so my understanding is fairly slim. We looked at 3 broad approaches, and there certainly are other approaches. We looked at a free market, first come, first served, and something called unitization. And the free market is very, very roughly, it's probably the closest we have to the status quo. It's not quite the case because we have consenting conditions and we have the Crown Estate process. But effectively, anyone can come along and lease a bit of seabed subject to those things. This doesn't give us any holistic planning because we're looking at one project at a time, apart from the Crown Estate deciding on zones, which is a bit different. It doesn't give us the forward visibility. It doesn't do anything to avoid overproduction unless there's real good monitoring and enforcement of consenting conditions. And it certainly doesn't deal with the underproduction problem. The only way to deal with that will probably be separate private contracts between the mutually dependent operators. So free market, we don't think works very well in this regard. And I'm skimming over it here. I'll give you details at the end on where to look up more detail on this. One of the problems of the free market is it gives massive project risk. If I build a tidal farm, I don't know if someone else is going to come along later and build another one that affects it. So one way of dealing with that project risk is a first come, first served approach, where later entrants are not allowed to disadvantage earlier ones. And that reduces the project risk for the first movers, but it also prevents newer and more innovative solutions coming along, and it prevents us from installing more capacity for a greater total output if that means less power for the first people who are there. So it's clearly not going to give us optimal results. It might discourage overproduction depending on the order the things are installed in, but generally it doesn't do what we need. As you can probably guess, we like unitization. I'm not going to go into this in detail for time reasons, but it's an approach that is common in oil and gas. And the idea on the tidal side would be that one developer would be appointed to operate or coordinate all of the tidal farms in a region on behalf of all of their owners, to maximize the overall yield with a pre-existing split of the profits. And the pre-existing part is important there because it prevents them competing with each other. We like that a lot. It allows the potential and the incentive for doing holistic planning. It means that overproduction is not an issue because you'd only be hurting yourself. And it means that when there is an underproduction problem, the incentives are all aligned correctly for everyone to want to figure it out in the optimal way. So we like the last option. It doesn't have to be unitization. There are other ways of achieving this, for example, by government involvement. But if we want to optimally exploit the resource, then we think an interventionist, centrally planned approach is going to be necessary. And it would be good to have that in place before rather than after it becomes necessary. Wrapping up, there's a very quick thing on limitations here. We know this effect will exist. We don't know how bad it is, simply because most of the research that we've based this analysis on is looking at the maximum possible power extraction from a channel, regardless of economic and environmental considerations, which isn't going to happen. So there's some future work I'm planning to try and look at more realistic scenarios, see how bad these effects are and what the actual effect on the cost of energy might be. So with that, apologies for going slightly over time. Thank you for your attention. Big acknowledgements to my co-authors on this work, one of whom was at Marine Scotland Science at the time, and another of whom I think now works at Marine Scotland since then. Thank you to the funders. If you'd like more information, the paper about this was in Marine Policy last year. If you have a subscription to Marine Policy, there is the link. If you don't have a subscription to Marine Policy, just drop me an email and I'm very happy to send you a copy. With that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. That was fantastic. Really interesting presentation there. We had one question from Richard in the chat, which I'll do first. And he says, how do you avoid shifting baselines for EIAs?
I'm guessing he means that the baseline for number 2 becomes the situation with with number 1 array in place already.
I think so, yeah.
That's a really good question. I don't know. My expertise is more on the technical physics side rather than the policy, but it's something I'd like to look at. If that's something he's interested in, maybe you'd like to get in touch.
Yeah, an interesting point actually that you raised in your talk. I thought that one was worth a bit more information right enough. So Richard, get in touch with Simon and he will tell you more. So we have another question on the chat here, on the Q&A, sorry. The diagrams suggest that tidal farms are close to the coast. Is that mostly the case? And is there an optimum depth for the turbines? Debbie also says, plus in order to replace other non-renewable forms of energy, how much of our energy needs to come from tides? How much is made up from tidal energy at present? And what is the likely maximum scale up?
Okay, there's, I think at least 3 questions there, but fortunately I can see it on my screen, so that's all right.
Grand. There's another bit as well about issues, continuity.
So close to the coast, there is no reason they have to be close to the coast. The ones that have been built so far tend to be, but the reality is that they have to be where the tide is flowing the fastest. And that is usually close to the coast, because where we get the very fast flows is usually where the tide is being forced through either a narrow gap or around a headland. So they would not usually be a long way offshore. There isn't really an optimum depth, except that in an ideal world, you'd like it deeper enough that ships can pass overhead, but you don't want it so deep that it gets really expensive to install and maintain anything. And there are different approaches to that. Some people have floating turbines, which nobody's going to pass overhead, but that keeps the maintenance costs down. In order to replace other non-renewable forms of energy, how much needs to come from the tides? That question I'm not going to answer in terms of how much needs to come from the tides. Probably the more important limitation is how much could we get in terms of the UK resource. How much is from tidal energy at present is small. In Scotland, at spring tide, when they're the strongest, it will be a few percent at the moment. It's obviously a lot less in a UK context. The maximum scale up, there are some very varied estimates on this. There's a kind of a huge range of estimates, but at a UK level, I think if we really went for it, we could get between 5 and 10% of our electricity from the tides. So it's not going to be massively world altering at the level of offshore wind, just because the number of places that are good for tidal energy extraction is not that great, especially for these first generation devices. But more than half of Europe's potential is in the UK, and more than half of the UK's potential is in Scotland. So it's not going to be globally important or even that important UK-wise, but it's quite important for Scotland potentially. And issues with continuity of energy, the tide, as you know, ebbs and flows, and when it's not moving, we get no power. So it does come and go. The difference from things like wind and solar is that we can predict years or tens or hundreds of years in advance exactly when it's going to come and go. And that's really valuable because it means you can plan other energy sources around it.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Simon. So I don't see any other questions on YouTube, but that we got quite a lot of questions in there in one. So thanks a million, Simon, for your time, and we'll fire on to the next talk.
Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. So next up, our final speaker is Kelly James, who is going to be talking to us about her research in blue carbon. Hi, Kelly.
Hi there. Cool, I think I've got that.
So hi everyone, I'm Kelly and I'm going to be speaking to you about my PhD project. So this is looking at blue carbon storage in Scottish coralline algae beds. So coralline algae beds are also referred to as Merle, and actually my colleague was speaking on BBC Radio 6 this morning about them, and there's also an article in BBC News and elsewhere about them. So if you want to learn more, have a look at the news today and they're there. So this works in collaboration with Marine Scotland, Nature Scot and the Lyle Centre, and it's also part of the Blue Carbon Forum. So the Blue Carbon Forum is this big forum in Scotland, and they've got partners everywhere from Oban to Edinburgh to Aberdeen, so it's a major forum. So just to give you a bit of background first about blue carbon. So climate change, as we know, is going to have major effects on both the natural and anthropogenic world. And unless we do something about it, we're going to be seeing mass extinctions, extreme climate events, and it's like a really serious problem. So one way in which we can help to mitigate it is through carbon drawdown by natural systems. So this is a nature-based solution. Basically how it works is these habitats absorb CO2 via photosynthesis, and they store either in their soil or in their sediment. So this carbon drawdown can occur in both terrestrial systems and marine systems. So I'm sure many of you have heard the government and industries pledge to plant so many thousands of trees for carbon storage and climate change. So in the last decades, there's been a lot of work with regards to blue carbon. So that's carbon stored in marine ecosystems. And there's been a real focus on three traditional habitats. So that's seagrass beds, salt marshes and mangroves. So we don't have any mangroves in Scotland, but we do have salt marshes and seagrasses. So when you compare blue carbon to green carbon, what has been found is actually these traditional stores are really efficient at burying carbon. And per unit area, they can store up to 1,000 times more carbon than tropical, boreal and temperate forests. So they're going to play a really important role in helping to mitigate climate change. However, more recently, there's been a focus on other blue carbon stores, and this is what I work on, so Coraline algae. So Coraline algae is a seaweed, and it's not a coral. So it forms this beautiful pink 3D calcified structure. And when you see it, when you dive and you see it, it's absolutely beautiful. The whole bed's kind of pink. So it's photosynthetic, it's a seaweed, so it does store carbon within the tissues. But when individual pieces come together, they intertwine and lock together, and it becomes a coralline algae bed. Now, coralline algae beds are so diverse. So not only do they have the pink coralline algae themselves, but they also have other things like bristle stars and sponges, loads of crustaceans like your crabs, loads of other types of seaweed. They're really beautiful, diverse habitats. Recently, we found they also store carbon. So coralline algae beds are found both nationally and globally. So this is just a map of where they're found in Scotland. And as you can see, they're predominantly on the west coast, but you can also get them in Orkney and Shetland. So you don't really get them around the east coast. On a global scale, they are found from the Arctic to the Antarctic, the equator, pretty much everywhere. They're a really abundant seaweed. So this means the fact they store carbon, it means they probably have a role on a global scale in carbon storage. So how do they store carbon? So first of all, as I said, they're photosynthetic. So that means they can absorb and draw down carbon from the atmosphere as CO2 and store it within their skeletons and tissues. They can also trap other types of organic material, whether that be organic carbon within crabs or kelp within the seabed, or it be organic carbon from seagrass meadows and macroalgae from the intertidal shore. So they can store carbon from quite a far way away. Basically, it travels to the seabed, it lands on the seabed, it doesn't necessarily disappear, instead it's buried over time. And what we've found is that once the carbon's buried in the bed, it can be stored for thousands of years. So a lot of the research so far has been done on a bed in Loch Sween, so that's where this photo comes from. And this bed's 4,000 years old. So carbon has been being drawn down, being stored here for the last 4,000 years. So it's a really long-term solution for climate change. When you compare coralline algae with more traditional habitats, what we found is they have a similar capacity for storing carbon. So what this graph shows is the amount of carbon stored in the top 25 centimetres. And they're quite similar to seagrass, and they store more than kelp forests and marine sediments. However, as I said, a lot of the work so far has been done on one bed in Loch Sween, and there's quite a lot of variation in coralline beds around Scotland that we kind of need to account for. So this is where my PhD project comes into it. So the first thing we're looking at is how carbon storage varies with bed health. So the bed that we've done most of the work on has been a very alive bed. As you can see in the left picture, it's very pink. The coralline algae is definitely alive. It's a very diverse habitat. Because of either natural reasons or trawling or coastal infrastructure, the coralline algae can die and it kind of turns this white colour. When it does die, we're not really sure what that means for carbon storage. We think that there's still a lot of carbon potentially stored in the bed because it has been locking up that carbon for thousands of years, but it may no longer actively take carbon down. So this is one of the things we're looking into. The other thing we need to account for is bed structure. So the bed we've been working on in Loch Sween is what we call a tidal formed bed. So it's in a very sheltered location. There's a lot of low wave energy. It's a very silty environment. On the other hand, in Barra, Orkney, Shetland, you get these beds called waveform beds. So they form in a really high energy environment, and they form these really cool strips. And it's like when you go to the beach and the water moves the sand, so it forms ripples. That's exactly what they do to the Merle bed, but on a giant scale. So between these strips, it's about 1 metre wide. So they're amazing to look under the water. So we want to find out how carbon storage varies there. Finally, it's really important to understand how carbon storage will vary in a future environment. So the oceans, they're going to get warmer, they're going to get more acidic. We really need to explore this so we can understand their current and future role in blue carbon storage. So how do we do this? So last year we were fortunate enough to go on a month-long field trip around Scotland in September, and believe it or not, September is the best time of year to go diving because the water is very warm. So these pictures are from Barra, and the aim of this trip was to collect sediment cores in different types of beds so we could explore how much carbon is in the sediment. So what you do is you go down with basically a piece of drain pipe and a massive hammer, and you hammer this drain pipe. It's very, very difficult underwater. Then you attach this lift bag, so it's basically a bag you fill with air, and it pulls the sediment core out. And it's really hard to do this as well because it's just absolutely sucked in. So this is very hard work. Once you get it out, you have to keep it upright, otherwise your layers will mix and you won't be able to get all the information you want. So you have to carry it upright underwater, get it to the boat, and look after it all the way to the shore. So this is the photo of me with my first core, and it took 2 days to get, and it's just such a sense of achievement when you finally get your first core. I don't think in publications they mention how hard some of these science things can be. So once you get it to shore, we freeze it and then we cut it into sections. So the photo on the bottom right, it shows a section of a core. So we've got the lovely pink coralline algae on the top and the sediment that's trapped underneath, so the organically rich sediment. We chop it into sections and then we basically go analyze it for carbon. So this is what I'm doing right now in the lab. I'm in my second year, so 2 out of 4 years. And obviously COVID meant we couldn't get in for a bit, so I just started to be able to do this now. So we haven't got the data yet, but we will get it soon. So what's the importance of this, all these questions? So understanding the role of coralline algae in carbon storage is really important because it's a nature-based solution. So back in 2014, Scottish Natural Heritage released this publication, and it was a massive collaboration between loads of different scientists in Scotland, and it looked at the amount of carbon that's stored in different habitats. Now, some of these habitats, there was already quite a lot of information about this previously, so they made quite a good assessment about how much carbon was there. But with coralline algae, we really knew very little about it, and there was a lot of gaps that were identified. So this PhD is starting to fill some of these gaps. This is really important because Scotland has pledged to become carbon neutral by 2045. And as well as knowing how much carbon we emit as CO2, we also need to know how much carbon is stored in our natural ecosystem. So this PhD will help resolve that. Scotland's also a global leader in blue carbon science, and especially with the national assessments, not many countries have looked at all their marine ecosystems and tried to figure out how much carbon is being drawn down by them. So other countries could use this kind of assessment as a case study to figure out how they could go carbon neutral and how much carbon is stored in their environment. So it's got implications on a global scale as well. We also really need to figure out how coralline algae will continue to act in the future. If we're going to be carbon neutral, we want to stay carbon neutral in the future. And if we find that coralline algae starts to release carbon or store more carbon, we need to account for this in future predictions. And finally, we need to continue to show that they store carbon. So although in Scotland they're a priority marine feature, elsewhere globally, there's a lot of beds that are being degraded, for example, in Brazil. So if we continue to show that these beds are really important in climate mitigation, then hopefully on a global scale, it will provide more evidence for their global protection. So thank you. Thanks as well to all my funders and support. And if you would like to get in contact with me outside this, there's my email address, and you can also follow me on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kelly. That was a fantastic, really interesting talk about your work. We had a question in the Q&A from Richard, and he says, I'm about to start a similar study on kelp's role in carbon sequestration. Have you undertaken any research on whether Coraline algae has an impact on gas partial pressures and that CO2 is drawn across the air-water interface?
Oh, so that's a very good question. I know there's been a lot of work on this. I've not necessarily done it myself. They can create their own sort of chemical environment in the water column. So yes, they will probably change the partial pressure a bit. And CO2, it is drawn through the air-water interface, but it's a cycle. It's not necessarily that coralline algae suck it from the air, it just dissolves into the water and then they take it from the water. So I hope that answers the question. If you have any more questions, just send me an email as well.
Okay, and we have another question from Debbie. Where coralline algae has been damaged, can it be restored? And does rising temperature cause any damage as it does with coral? So that's an interesting one when you were talking there about your how your research might be applicable elsewhere in places like Brazil.
Yeah, definitely. So there's quite a few different species of coralline algae. So similarly to plant species, the more polar species will be really struggling with temperature. Once it's damaged, it grows less than 1 millimeter a year. It's such a slow growing species. It's very hard to restore it. So there are historic places, for example, in Scotland where it has been damaged and it just won't grow back, maybe over hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's really important. That's why we really need to protect it, because it's not something that you can just turn back and make better. You just need to protect what's there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great, thanks for that. I don't see any questions on the YouTube link, and I think that's it from the Q&A. So thanks very much, Kelly. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly, for that. I just want to say that that's the end of our webinar. So a big thank you to everyone who joined us and listened in. And a massive thank you to MASTS and our speakers today for hosting and organising this event as part of our Climate Week. We still have a lot of events coming up throughout the week that you can find on our Eventbrite Scottish Government webpage. We've got an energy workshop next from Home Energy Scotland for the energy theme, and then throughout the week we've got waste, travel and water still to go. So hopefully you can join us for some of those events coming up. Yeah, a massive thank you and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.